Tonight, Rabbi Rosen is going to speak to us on the most appropriate topic for the theme of dialogue, and it is titled From Disputation to Dialogue, Jewish-Catholic Relations in Our Time. Rabbi Rosen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alan. It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening, and I look forward to, after my monologue, having opportunity for genuine dialogue with all of you. The first years of the 20th century, a gentleman whose name you will all be familiar with, Theodor Herzl, was hawking his wares around Europe, meeting with every major leader, potentate, monarch that he could encounter to impress upon them the need for the establishment of a Jewish political autonomous entity in its ancestral homeland, and generally arguing as to why this would be in their interests. Amongst the meetings that Herzl managed to have arranged was a meeting with the Pope at that time, who had the name Pius X. And Theodor Herzl records in his diaries this meeting and what was said at that meeting. In fact, that meeting was only a few months before Theodor Herzl's very untimely death, if I'm not mistaken, at the age of 44. At this meeting, Herzl presented to the Pope the idea for the establishment of a Jewish national homeland as a state in its ancestral homeland, and suggested even that this would be to the advantage of the church, could guarantee the protection of holy sites, and so on and so forth. Theodor Herzl, he didn't know too much about Judaism, but probably knew even just as little about Christianity, because he was a bit surprised with the rebuff he got from a well-mannered pontiff, but who told him very clearly and straight, as it were, eye to eye, that he could not recognize the idea of a Jewish state. He could not recognize the Jewish people because the Jewish people had not recognized Jesus. And he subsequently added that he can't stop the Jews returning to Palestine, but if they do, his priests will all be ready there with holy water to baptize them all. Now, Pius X wasn't a particularly nasty piece of work. Most popes wouldn't have even given Theodor Herzl the time of day. He at least received him graciously, and he listened to him, and he wasn't trying to be hostile. He was articulating what had been, and continued to be for quite a while, the normative Christian approach towards Jews and Judaism, which had already been articulated by the Church Fathers, which went more or less as follows. The Jews failed to recognize a full dispensation that came about through the coming of Jesus of Nazareth, and therefore they were replaced by a new Israel, the true Israel, that is the church. The Jewish people, therefore, was punished for this failure through the destruction of the temple and exile. And indeed, now following on with Augustine, the only reason that the Jews continue to survive once they've already fulfilled their destiny and basically have no purpose in the world because Christianity has replaced them, they only survive to testify precisely through their homelessness and their suffering and their degradation to the truth of Christianity. What happens to you when you fail to accept the true dispensation? And therefore, Pius X was simply telling Theodor Herzl what it was normative Christian theology, the idea of the return of the Jewish people to its ancestral homeland, to establish autonomy, let alone sovereignty in that land, was an anathema for the normative teaching of the Christian world. This teaching, this whole approach of replacement, supersessionism, of marginalization of the Jew being essentially a suffering testimony to the validity of Christianity. All of that is part and parcel of what the great Jewish historian, French Jewish historian Jules Isaac coined the teaching of contempt. And this teaching of contempt paved the way for atrocities against the Jewish people down the course of history, with generally the argument, well, they deserve it because they're Jews and they're continuing to be stubborn and rejecting it. And this attitude, if you like, reached its zenith with the Shoah, with the Holocaust. I'm not suggesting that the Holocaust was a Christian initiative, of course not. In fact, there was a great Anglo-Jewish writer by the name of Maurice Samuel, who in his book, which I think was titled The Longest Hatred, something along those lines, he argued that in fact, the Nazi campaign was an attack on Christianity. Judaism was, if you like, the particularly vulnerable aspect of Christianity that needed to be eradicated, but ultimately the attack was on the church as a whole. Well, one can agree or disagree about that. But what is certainly clear is that even if it wasn't a Christian campaign, it couldn't have succeeded to the degree it did without those generations, centuries of nurturing the ground with this teaching of contempt. The Shoah was a Jewish tragedy, not only Jewish tragedy, but of course overwhelmingly a Jewish tragedy, but it was a Christian scandal because it was perpetrated by ostensibly baptized Christians in ostensibly Christian lands. And the failure of the Christian world then to do more than it did, and sometimes even to very openly collaborate and even laud and praise the Nazis and their policies, was a testimony to how profoundly that negative attitude towards Jews had seeped into Christian and European consciousness. But during times of greatest tragedy, we also see times of greatest heroism. And times when you see the worst in humanity, you can often see the best. And so it was also with the Christian church at that time, where there were certain very remarkable individuals. Probably for the majority, it remains a very confused era, where I doubt whether the majority were totally sanguine about what was happening to the Jews, but it didn't bother them too much. And then there were interests that came into play that probably explain the attitude or the failures of Pope Pius XII, the pontiff at the time. But amongst the remarkable heroes, those whom we refer to as Chasidei Umot HaOlam, the righteous of the Gentiles, was the man who was the papal legate in Turkey at the time. He was a roly-poly priest by the name of Angelo Roncalli. And he was one of the first to get information from Jewish sources about what was happening in terms of the Nazi extermination machine. And he brought information very early to the Vatican, to the pontiff, and was distressed by the decisions not to do more than was done. And he, at his own initiative, took some very significant decisions and had an important role in saving thousands of Jews from the clutches of the Nazis. One of the ways in which he influenced was through his own personal familiarity with King Boris of Bulgaria, where he had spent time. And he was definitely a major factor in Boris's determination not to collaborate with the Nazis in handing over the Jews in Bulgaria. But more than that, Roncalli actually collaborated with the representatives of the Zionist organization in Eastern Europe and provided false baptismal certificates at a time when if you were a baptized Jew, you could get out from the clutches of the Nazis. And for us, this might not seem a big deal. What's a certificate? It's a piece of paper, so somebody signs it. But for a Christian, baptism is a holy sacrament. And to testify that somebody is part of a holy sacrament when they're not is a very big deal for a Christian priest. And therefore, this is an example of how Roncalli went, if you like, beyond the letter of the law in order to be able to do all he can to save Jews. And the plight of the Jews and the tragedy of the Jews touched him profoundly. He subsequently was appointed the Patriarch of Venice, but people were surprised, I would say probably most people in the world were surprised, when with the death of Pius XII, he was elected to be his successor, and he took the name John the 23rd. As John the 23rd, he was expected to be, if you like, a bridge between pontificates, somebody who would be a stopgap and not somebody who would do anything terribly dramatic. He proved to have done arguably the most dramatic thing for the church in modern times. He convened what was known as the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council, which brought in the bishops from the world to update the church, its theology, and its whole approach to the modern world. It's something that only a pontiff can do, but there are advantages and disadvantages to having a pontiff. But he used the language of aggiornamento, updating, and he used all kinds of metaphors that really scandalized many of the more conservative elements within the church. He says, it's musty and dusty here in the church. We need to open the windows, let the fresh air in. Let's have a reappraisal. And many very significant changes came about as a result of the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council. One of the issues that was really dear to his heart was the whole question of the relationship to the Jews. There are many very interesting stories about John the 23rd. Those of you who know Rome know that the great synagogue is on the Lungo Tevere, the road just along the Tiber that leads on into the Vatican, and therefore is still a major thoroughfare. One very famous story is how when, shortly after his appointment as Pope, John the 23rd was traveling along that road, and on a Shabbat, when people were coming out or maybe going in to the synagogue, or maybe both, he stopped the car and got out and he blessed the Jews. And that was a rather dramatic act. He also made some immediate changes in liturgy. Until then, in the Good Friday prayers, there had been a prayer for the perfidious Jew to remove the blindness from his sight and to pray for the perfidious Jew. He eliminated the word perfidious from the liturgy in the Easter Triduum prayers at the time. But he realized there was something more that needed to be done. What was really the clincher was a meeting between him and the man I mentioned earlier, the historian, French Jewish historian, Jules Isaac. And Jules Isaac had tried with Pius XII to be able to get his attention, to try after the Shoah to impress upon him how much the church needed to be able to change its approach, but never succeeded in getting through to Pius XII. John the 23rd received him with alacrity, and the reports of the conversation were a very warm one, in which Jules Isaac didn't pull any punches. He presented to him the litany of contempt in the church's teaching towards the Jews, and he asked for a radical revision. And as he left, he said to John the 23rd, "May I have reason to hope?" And John the 23rd said to him, "You have more than reason to hope." And John the 23rd was good to his word. And he gave the task of looking at this whole question of De Judeus, the relationship with the Jews, to Cardinal Augustin Bea, and together with a team, they started working on a text which faced enormous opposition within the church and amongst the bishops for two main reasons. There were those who were opposing it theologically because they didn't agree with the changes that the Pope wanted to make. And there were others, obviously, from the Arab world and from the Muslim world in particular, that were worried that it would be seen as a political statement and threaten their well-being within the Arab-Muslim world. And this document went through all sorts of ups and downs. And John the 23rd didn't even live to see the conclusion. He died before the document was formulated in its final version and well before it was promulgated. It was promulgated under the pontificate of Paul VI, but it proved to be a real game changer. Incidentally, in order to be able to get the main clause in this document, Vatican documents are a bit lahavdil like our weekly portions of the Torah. They tend to have the names either of the first word or the central word in the first sentence. And this particular document that was promulgated in 1965 is known as Nostra Aetate, which means in our times. And Nostra Aetate's main clause is clause 4 because it deals with the whole relationship with the Jewish people. But what's really interesting is that in order to get through the opposition, the proposers had to prepare a document that was broader and that would include relations to all other religions or to other religions in the world in general terms, and then specifically to Judaism and to Islam, and even reference to Eastern religions. It's really interesting. Thanks to the need to be able to address its relationship with the Jewish people, the church developed a whole new theology towards religiosity, spirituality, to finding God beyond the confines of the church, which is very interesting in itself. But what interests us above all is clause 4, because clause 4 says very dramatic things. It says any attempt to present the Jews as rejected, as spurned by God and replaced by the church is wrong. The covenant between God and the Jewish people is an eternal covenant. God does not repent of his gifts and calling, which is the text of a subsequent document that was released. It affirms that the covenant has validity, and above all, the document repudiated the idea that the Jews have collective guilt for the death of Jesus, either collectively at the time, let alone in perpetuity, rejecting the deicide charge. And it also condemned anti-Semitism by condemnation. This radical shift in the theology of the church paved the way for some very significant developments. And of course, what happens with an authoritarian structure, and especially one where there is the one central figure at the top of the pyramid, is that the change can be transmitted with an impact that is far more dramatic than it would be, if you like, in a more egalitarian democratic framework. And the changes, as I said, had profound impact. Now, once you say that the people are not rejected and that God's covenant with the Jewish people is eternal, then there's no longer any objection to the idea of the return of the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland and their establishment of independence in it. And according to John the 23rd secretary, a man by the name of Loris Capovilla, who died only a few years ago, I think somewhere around the age of 103, and only towards the end of his life was he made a cardinal as an act of, an honorific act. According to Capovilla, John the 23rd wanted to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. But as I mentioned, he didn't even live to see the promulgation of 65. A more cautious pope came in his place, Paul VI. Perhaps when Paul VI visited the Holy Land in 64 and invited Israel's representatives to meet with him at Megiddo, even though he didn't do so in Jerusalem, and that was seen as a slap in the face, perhaps Paul VI was testing the waters. His words that he sent to the Jewish leadership were very conciliatory and indicated a desire for more, and perhaps already intimated that something like Nostra Aetate was around the corner. Of course, the reactions within the Arab world were very, very negative to that visit, and perhaps that was what prevented him from moving ahead, but nothing happened. I'll come back to that point in a moment. But one of the consequences of the promulgation of Nostra Aetate was the establishment of a commission for religious relations with the Jews to pursue and promote dialogue between the church and the Jewish people. I've been a member of that body for more than 30 years, and I have actually presided, sorry, I've skipped, I've gone a little bit too quick. So in response, the Vatican was welcoming Jewish interlocutors, and it found that there were too many interlocutors. And each organization and each body was coming along and said, we're the ones that really represent the Jewish people. You don't want to talk to those others, talk to us. So the Vatican did something which I tell my friends there that only the church could have done, because it's quite a miracle that it brought all these different Jewish streams, denominations, and organizations all together. Because it said, get your act together, form a particular body that represents the Jewish people. And this body is called the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations. It has a very appropriate acronym, ITCH-KICK, because being made up of these organizations, it itches and it kicks all the time because each one is arguing with the other, but more or less, it's done quite a good job of representing the Jewish people formally to the Vatican, and subsequent to that, there's a formal relationship with the World Council of Churches that involves the Protestant churches and even with the Ecumenical Patriarch on behalf of the Orthodox churches. It's been my privilege to twice be the chairman of ICHKIC, so dealing with Jewish organizations I'm familiar with. People sometimes say to me, if I may make a witticism aside, why do you spend so much time with the Goyim? Isn't there work to do amongst the Jews, trying to bring about reconciliation between us? I say to them, that's much, much too difficult. Being able to deal with reconciliation with the Gentiles is much easier and much more pleasant. At any rate, getting back to the truth of the matter is that I didn't actually choose to get involved in this work. I was a rabbi in South Africa in the height of the apartheid era, and one of the few ways that you could bring people together against government policy was actually through interreligious encounter. And I therefore started getting to know the different religious communities through a commitment to social justice and bringing people together across what was known as the color bar. But as I got involved in it, I discovered, first of all, that these people were amazingly ignorant about me and about my tradition and my heritage. And even those who had Jewish friends socially didn't know very much about Judaism. And those who thought they knew often had completely distorted perceptions and misconceptions, both Christians as well as Muslims that I encountered there. The truth is, as I got more involved in this, I realized that I was pretty ignorant too, and I had all kinds of misconceptions and stereotypes and misunderstandings about their traditions and heritage. And if I wanted to be understood, I needed to understand. I realized how critically important this was to combat anti-Semitism, to promote mutual understanding, and to work for shared values. If people share certain basic human values that are important to you, flowing out of your own religious heritage, then surely you have an obligation to work together with them to be greater than the sum of your different parts. If you don't do so, in a sense, you're betraying those. And I got involved in this, found it very enriching. When I was in Ireland, you know, one of my predecessors was Lord Jakobowicz, subsequently Chief Rabbi of the British Commonwealth. He used to say, in Ireland, 95% are Catholic, 5% are Protestants, and I'm Chief Rabbi of the rest. So you can't do your job very well if you're not involved in engaging the society at large. And of course, a chief rabbi there is a state figure, so you're involved in all the state academic, cultural life of the country. So the interfaith area became really important. And at that time, 40 years ago, there were not many Orthodox rabbis that were so interested in this whole field. And so I believe that during the Second World War, they used to say, join the army and see the world. I discovered a much nicer way of doing so through interfaith relations, and I believe passionately in it. So that has been a great blessing for me. At any rate, getting back to the Vatican, there were subsequent documents that came following the Nostra Aetate. There was a document known as the Guidelines on Nostra Aetate that elaborated the themes. Subsequently, and that was about 10 years later, another 10 years, there was a document known as the Notes on Teaching and Preaching. All of these are fascinating documents. And of course, then we had this remarkable man, Karol Wojtyła, who took the name John Paul II, who certainly today we can see had his serious flaws. But he was a man who knew the Jewish community intimately in his childhood days and grown up in a city where a third of the population was Jewish in Katowice, with very close Jewish friends. And the tragedy of the Shoah was his tragedy in two ways. First of all, it was a tragedy of Poland, which was a great tragedy in itself. But these were his friends also at that particular time. Subsequently, we learned of how immediately after the Shoah, when he was a novice, he returned Jewish children who had been baptized and saved by Catholic parents, by Catholic couples, required them to return those children back to their natural Jewish parents, which was not the norm amongst Christian leadership at the time. And we also know that he actually saved people during that particular period. And he took the relationship with the Jewish people to another level. One of the fascinating things about John Paul II was that it was a pope from behind the Iron Curtain who understood the language of Madison Avenue, that is advertising, images. And he was very powerful in terms of his images. People don't read documents today, hardly at all. But even then, they were not reading many documents. And people within the church didn't read their own church documents, let alone people outside the church. And many Jews are very skeptical about how genuine this had been. But people do watch television. And the images of the Pope going to the synagogue in 1986 in Rome and embracing Rabbi Toaf, the chief rabbi, and referring to Jews as the dearly elder brothers of the church. And then subsequently also defining anti-Semitism as a sin against God and man. And then encouraging the establishment of diplomatic relations with Israel. And we'll come to his visits to Israel in a moment.
All of these things made it clear to people around the world, from whatever religion they were, but particularly importantly, both within the Jewish world and within the Catholic world, that a sea change had taken place in terms of the Catholic Church's approach towards Jews and Judaism. But, and of course, not only that, he also visited Auschwitz, and the strong words there when he visited Auschwitz at the time. But the absence of diplomatic relations between the Vatican and Israel always left something of a question mark. That the Catholic Church is the only church that has a state body in the Vatican state. And if it didn't have any theological objections to the idea of the Jewish return to our ancestral homeland, then why didn't it have diplomatic relations? Well, the church sought to explain that the problem was their fear for the well-being of their communities in Arab lands and how this may impact their interests in relation to the Muslim world. But not everybody was buying it, and even if it had its legitimacy, there was still certain skepticism. Things changed after the First Gulf War. In 1991, John Paul II gave instructions to his Secretariat of State, to the political structure, to open up, explore negotiations with Israel on the establishment of full diplomatic relations. Actually, from the Vatican's point of view, it wasn't just the establishment of full diplomatic relations. For the Vatican, it was the negotiation of a concordat that would ensure the status and the rights of the church and of its faithful under the authority of a Jewish state, as it had negotiated with other bodies in the world that have a religiously defining identity, where a concordat was seen as an appropriate thing to do. I am, to some extent, the beneficiary of other people's ignorance and absence in some way. So our foreign ministry, which is responsible, obviously, for the negotiation of anything diplomatic, is made up of people who have competency in many different areas, but one area where they don't have competency, almost all the diplomatic service, is in the area of interreligious relations. And why would they? But there was a recognition that on the other side of the table were not only diplomats and legal experts, but men of the cloth. Therefore, it would be a good idea if on our side there was somebody who at least knew the difference between a Catholic and a Protestant, if not between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. So I was brought in to be part of that particular team. And there was very exciting times, which I'd be happy to tell you, but if I spend more time on that, I won't be able to get you through the rest of what I have to talk about. One of the most important things of this fundamental agreement, which was concluded in 1993 with an exchange of ambassadors in 1994, was it paved the way for the papal visit of John Paul II on what is called the Jubilee pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Because Israel wasn't going to play the same kind of game that it played with Paul VI, even if Paul VI's motives might have been pure. Israel felt humiliated by that visit. This visit could only take place as a full state visit, in which he would give full respect to Israel's highest elected officials. And that, of course, required that there be a full diplomatic relationship. And this was important for John Paul II for two reasons. First of all, he understood, the first pontiff really to understand, that the state of Israel is not just a location for Jews, and it's not even just a location that might be seen as something equivalent to the Vatican. It has to do with the very quest for authenticity of the Jewish people in our times. And therefore, if there wasn't a full relationship between the Vatican and Israel, there would always be a suspicion that this relationship was in some way significantly flawed. But also he wanted personally to visit Israel, to visit the Holy Land, to visit the shrines of Christianity in the year 2000. And therefore it was important for him to move ahead on that. And as I say, that visit was a remarkable moment for people around the world, but especially for Israelis. One needs to bear in mind most Israelis have never met a modern Christian. We have an indigenous Christian Arab population, but most Israelis never meet them really. And if they meet them, they might meet them as people providing certain services, but are seen as part of the Israeli Arab population. And of course, that's fraught with other complications and tensions. And even though we Israelis love to travel abroad, the Wanderlust in our blood, nevertheless, we tend to meet non-Jews precisely as non-Jews, not as modern Christians. And therefore, the image of Christianity was still overwhelmingly taken from the negative, tragic past. And that's why to see the Pope with these gestures the kotel, putting there a text of a prayer that he had composed for a liturgy 2 weeks before, asking God's forgiveness for all the sins committed against Jews down the ages by the church. At Yad Vashem, in tearful solidarity with Jewish suffering and pain, where these stories I referred to earlier became more widely exposed, I would say blew Israelis' minds. It was an amazing event. In fact, I remember that the prime minister at the time, Ehud Barak, said he was really glad when the Pope was leaving because he was worried that the whole country was going to convert to Catholicism. The impact had been so positively powerful of the Pope's visit. Of course, he was joking, but nevertheless, a little bit of an element of truth of how profound that impact was. So during that visit, the Pope, at his initiative, chose to meet with the chief rabbis of Israel and chief rabbinate council. And at that meeting, he said to them, look, there is a body that represents the Jewish people to the Holy See, but I would like us, the chief rabbinate of Israel and the Holy See, to have a direct line. I want us to have our own bilateral commission. Fortunately, the Pope didn't know exactly what the chief rabbinate of Israel was. He just knew it was the official representative body. But nobody told him, I think, that the chief rabbinate of Israel doesn't even have a commission for dialogue with other kinds of Jews. They'd never thought of having a commission for dialogue with another religion. But when a Pope asks you to do so, it's rather difficult to say no. Here again, yours truly was a beneficiary because the chief rabbinate needed somebody who's an Orthodox rabbi who knows what he's doing and how to be able to handle this whole situation. So this formal bilateral commission, which meets annually, one alternatively in Rome and then in Jerusalem, and has covered an enormous range of social and scientific issues of discussion, looking at it from the perspectives of our different tradition, which has opened up the eyes of the rabbis who had never really, most of them had never even encountered a non-Jew, let alone a prelate within the churches, to different perspectives, and has built up bonds of friendship, has been very significant, and its internal work all falls on me. So I'm a member of that commission, but I voluntarily have to do the real work in terms of its content. Incidentally, Canterbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, Rowan Williams, got a little bit jealous of the fact that we have a commission with the with Vatican. And at his initiative and the late Lord Sachs, Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, we established another commission between the Chief Rabbinate of Israel and the Anglican Church under the auspices of the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is a parallel body as well. But this was all part and parcel of these dramatic changes that have taken place within the Catholic Church. What was remarkable was that this body served very much as a vehicle for being able to deal with issues and challenges and occasional eruptions in relation to the church far more effectively than the International Jewish Committee, which I referred to before. There are different reasons which I can explain for why that is, but it's a very important bilateral commission between the two entities. Pope Benedict XVI, even though he didn't have a very great public image, and he certainly didn't have the media appeal that his predecessor or successor have enjoyed, nevertheless was deeply committed to that reconciliation and followed in his predecessor's footsteps with a pilgrimage to Israel, with a visit to the synagogue, with a visit to Auschwitz, with strong condemnations of anti-Semitism. And of course, after that, we have a Pope now, Francis, who occasionally puts his foot wrong because he's not a systematic theologian like his predecessor, but nevertheless is clearly known to everybody in the world as a genuine friend of the Jewish people. He's written a book together with a friend rabbi from the time that he was a cardinal in Buenos Aires. Actually, at that time, he opened up his church for events like Shoah commemorations. He visited synagogues to celebrate Jewish festivals with them, and who has continued to perform those gestures that already John Paul II had enshrined. There have been a number of Jewish responses to these changes. Quite understandably, the vast majority of Jews who were engaged in the earliest days of this whole process of reconciliation came from the more liberal streams of Judaism, not difficult to understand why. But in more recent years, more recent decades, there has been an Orthodox representation increasingly. The first document that came from the Jewish people in response was a document issued in America by overwhelmingly from the Reform and Conservative movements called Dabru Emet, Speak the Truth. This enjoyed a very significant response. In 2015, the Vatican issued a document, another document called The Gifts and the Calling of God Are Eternal. God does not repent of his gifts. And in this document, it basically summarized all these changes that I've referred to now, but it had some very interesting comments. about the authenticity of Torah, that Jews are in this covenantal relationship with God, that they are saved. Basically, the church says we don't understand how everybody is saved through Jesus, and yet the Jews are in covenant. We don't know how to square that circle, but nevertheless, at the end of days, it will be resolved. But in the meantime, there is no mission to the Jews. It's not appropriate to try to missionize amongst the Jews, and Jews have their own authenticity. It doesn't say that about any other religious group. That's really quite remarkable, and emphasizes John Paul II's comment, and also his successors, that the dialogue and relationship with the Jewish people is unique, is intrinsic to the nature of the church. Christianity cannot understand itself if it doesn't understand its Jewish roots, and it cannot respect itself if it does not respect its Jewish roots. In 2016 and 2017, 2 Orthodox declarations were released, which were very significant, received very well by the church. These documents are called, one is to do the will of our Father in heaven, the other is called From Jerusalem to Rome. You can Google all of these documents and you can see them that testify to these changes that have taken place. I don't mean by this story that I'm now bringing to an end to say that everything is without any need of effort to pursue in terms of our relationship with the church. There are obviously areas of where there are differences, not least of all that relate to Israeli policies. One has to bear in mind that the local church in Israel and in the Holy Land is Palestinian, and it's natural that the church, the Vatican, is going to be concerned with the well-being of its faithful and to be able to articulate its positions. But I would say, generally speaking, with regards to Israel, the Catholic Church today is the most well-balanced and responsible Christian interlocutor that we have, of all of them. And that's quite remarkable for a church that was epitomized by those comments of Pius X to Herzl in 1904. There are still other areas of which we also have other differences, let's say to do with the whole question of the record during the Shoah. We have to bear in mind that for us, a pope is just another guy. For them, he's not just another guy. He is therefore the Almighty's representative on earth, and therefore they're naturally willing to be far more gracious in their interpretation of that history than we necessarily would be. And there are still much work to do in education. These changes have taken place at the Olympian Heights and in places where Jews interact with the Catholic Church closely and where therefore the Jewish community is very much on their radar screen, especially in North America. These changes are dramatic and are testified to in their educational materials and in the programs of training of priests. But in other places, Latin America, certain parts of Latin America, Africa, Asia, where there are no Jewish communities around in those particular contexts, very often Jews are not on the radar screen, and there very often attitudes haven't changed. So there's still significant educational work to do. But I think it's fair to say that we live in a golden age in terms of Jewish-Catholic relations. Today, when something is wrong and somebody says something wrong, we have an address. If a prelate says something that's anti-Semitic, then you can be pretty sure he's not going to get promotion. And I can testify to examples in that regard. All of this is, as I say, a dramatic testimony to changes, of which I've been very, very privileged to have been and continue to be a part. And my monologue was a little longer than I anticipated, but thank God we still got some time for some questions.
Fine. Well, I know that Sylvia Lewin has got her hand up. I'm going to ask Sylvia to unmute. If you've got the right computer, you will see on the bottom bar where it says reactions. If you go to reactions, you can press on raise your hand where you can ask a question. Or you could just
hold on me.
You can
Unmuted.
Would you please stay muted apart? Sylvia, would you like to?
Yes, if I may say, first of all, hello to Rabbi David Rosen, because he won't remember this, but I remember it very clearly. I will ask a question at the end of this, but when I was national president of B'nai B'rith, and you were the chief rabbi of Ireland, I came to visit my little brood there, and we met in the Briscoes' home, in Ben and Debbie Briscoe. I'm sure you remember them. And I was a bit cheeky at the time, and I asked you how many people you have. I hear you didn't have many because of the 95% and the 5% didn't leave you with much, but I asked you how many people you had under your wing, and you said 2,000, and I said to you, well, I've got 4,000 under my wing. Naboth was a big organization in this country in those days. So that's my very nice memory of having met you all those years ago in the 80s. But the question I wanted to ask you was, and it was fascinating to listen to you, thank you very, very much. With all this going on, is the Catholic Church telling its people that the Jews did not kill Jesus?
Or categorically. Of course, that doesn't mean, again, apropos my concluding comments, that there aren't places where people still think that, and where they're not being told not to think that, because it's not something that necessarily, as I say, features for so many people in areas where there are no Jewish communities, or where the relationship between the church and the Jewish people does not impact upon them. But if you ask, you will get no prelate who will tell you that the Jewish people are guilty today for the death of Jesus, or even were. And that is very clear as the formal teaching of the church. That much they know. They don't always know much more than that, but that they certainly do. Incidentally, getting back to your introductory comments, and of course it's a long time ago, and that was probably, there were probably 2,000 formally part of the community. There was probably many more than that who weren't. But in that time when I was there were more Jews in the door in the Irish Parliament than there were Protestants, even though there were 100 times as many Protestants as Jews.
Really?
There were Jews in every single party. And there were 60 Jewish organizations. And some of the Jewish youth movements are more active than elsewhere. And what it really shows is that you can have a Jewish community of hundreds of thousands with very little Jewish content, and you can have a Jewish community with just a few thousand that can be very vital and vibrant. Yeah. In fact, my one congregation in Cape Town, in South Africa, was a membership of 10,000 with 1,500 in Shul on the Shabbat. But that was a vibrant community.
Wow. Thank you. Lovely to see you again.
Thank you very much. Philip Hyman, I see you've got your hand up.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you, Rabbi. Also, thank you for the work you do. Jaw is always better than war or argue. I wanted to ask about the Catholic liturgy. Within the Catholic liturgy, there's an awful lot of adverse reference to the Jews in the John Passion and the Matthew Passion, and I know that from my love of music, because it's not Bach's fault that a lot of the text is a little bit anti-Semitic. But in the actual Catholic liturgy, some of their major ideas in their liturgy seems to be anti-Jewish.
So that's a really very interesting issue.
Thank you.
With regards to the liturgy, leaving aside scriptural readings, let's just talk of liturgy and not scripture. I don't think today you will find anywhere in the Catholic Church where you have anti-Semitic hymns used. And I think that, and the reference that I mentioned to the perfidious Jew has been removed. And Paul VI introduced a very nice prayer in its place, which I think we can definitely live with. The question then the other part of your question essentially refers to the use of scripture in the liturgy. And that's a problem, of course, for any tradition's scripture. And let us acknowledge that there are certain passages of our scripture which are not without their problematics as well. But now, part of the problem is, and this is the real challenge, we can't expect them. First of all, there is a debate as to whether those scriptures really are anti-Jewish or not. There certainly are those that believe they are. And certainly by the time that we get to the 4th century, even the 3rd century, they are being used in a derogatory way. But actually, in terms of their context, there is most scholarship today is able to put these texts in context. When you look at the discussions in the Talmud, you see the way rabbis talked about one another in debates and arguments. And they sound to us scurrilous. They sound to us horrific, how people who you would expect to be well-behaved can talk to one another and even describe one another. But that was part of the culture. It wasn't seen as something personal. It was a very different cultural context. You could use epithets in a debate over a principle and over an issue. And when you put Christian scriptures in context and you realize that these are internal Jewish discussions, and that in 90% of the cases, these are Jews talking to Jews. And there aren't just Jewish good guys. There are, from a Christian point of view, if you like, Jewish good guys and Jewish bad guys, but they're all Jews. And these are internal discussions amongst different elements within the Jewish people, and could be likened to some of the debates that take place within the Jewish people today. Not always the most savory, not always the most noble, but nevertheless, still recognizing that we're part of one entity. Now, once the church had detached itself from its Jewish roots, it lost that sense, and even started alienating and created the idea that there was another religion that had been created at that time, which of course was nonsense. None of the apostles saw themselves as anything other than Jewish. They saw themselves as what we would call today Messianic Jews. And that was the way they saw themselves at that particular time. Now, when you read scripture in that light, you read it very differently. So it's a matter of putting text in context. Now, there are places, again, certainly in North America, where priests are well trained and educated, and educate their flock with an introductory commentary and with a sermon so that these texts are understood in context. Is that the whole of the Christian world, let alone the whole of the Catholic world? No, we have a long way to go in that regard, but it's getting better every day. It is getting better every day.
Thank you. Jacqueline, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Rabbi Rosen. It's so interesting. I was just wondering if you've actually written a book or something I can read about your work.
I have something easier than that before you ask me my question. You can go to my website. You can even just Google my name, but my website is rabbidavidrosen.net. And there are a series of articles there, so you probably could find something satisfactory there.
Yes. The question I wanted to ask as well is there a similar dialogue going on with Muslims, with imams, with...
So this is a wonderful question.
The Quran, something like that. Yeah. This
is a wonderful question. And getting back to the previous question that I would address, there is a big difference, a very, very, very big difference between Islam and Christianity. And this was reflected in the fact that historically we never suffered under Islam the way we suffered under Christianity. Doesn't mean there was a picnic everywhere, and doesn't mean everywhere they were nice to us, but nothing like the Jews are in league with the devil, Jews are condemned to suffer, Jews are the enemies of God. Nothing that delegitimizes the Jewish religion. On the contrary, the Quran recognizes the Torah and the New Testament as divine revelation. And they recognize Jews and Christians as the peoples of the book. And even though we might see today the concept of the dhimma as something derogatory because it means a second-class status, nevertheless, the idea of the dhimma of protected minorities meant that under Islam we were far, far better off than we were under Christianity. Now, again, there were times when we were treated very brutally in certain Christian lands, but never to the same degree. And I don't think you could ever had anything within the Muslim world that would have facilitated a Shoah as Christianity did in terms of the Holocaust. What we face today and what we face in the last 100 years is something quite new and something quite awful, which is that while the Christian world has purified itself to a very large degree of these terrible perceptions of Jews, blood libels, that Jews are behind all the terrible, Black Death, the Great Plague, whatever it may be. Today, most young Christians, especially believing Christians, if you tell them about the things that Christians used to say about Jews in the past, they're horrified to know. Most of them don't even know about it. I'm not always sure whether that's good or bad. It's probably both. But in the Muslim world, these ideas which did not exist before, you didn't have these terrible conspiracy theory ideas, became normative in our times because of political factors. Yeah. And the political and almost every Christian canard that has been so substantially repudiated has been Islamicized and undergone a redaction for an Islamic constituency. And that's really terrible. And it's terrible, of course, for us especially here in Israel, because if our conflict here is a territorial one, as it essentially and historically is, then it can be resolved through territorial compromise. But if you believe it's a religious one, between the godly against the godless, between those of God and those of the devil, then it's unresolvable. It has to be, therefore, continuous, terrible blood. So the religionizing of the conflict, it's not a proper English word, but I'm using it, the religionizing of the conflict is very, very dangerous. And therefore, we have an existential need to engage the Muslim world more than anything else, more today than ever before. And the truth of the matter is, and here again I say, basically, I don't know, from an ideological point of view, it's much easier, because if we can resolve the political conflict, if we can, which is a big if we can resolve the political conflict, then there are not theological obstacles that are overwhelmingly in our way. And the proof of that is the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords that we have established last year, which are pursuant, and interestingly, when we signed agreement with Egypt and with Jordan, we never referred to any of what you might call the intangibles, the psycho-spiritual aspects to the relationship of Jews and Muslims. They are not there. That's what's really significant about the Abraham Accords. Calling these relationships, attributing them to Abraham, is saying something very important. It's saying we are one family and we have common religious, cultural roots, and these need to be recognized. That's important because what basically the Emirates and Bahrain, and of course it was not such a big effort for Morocco because this was to a large degree obvious for them, but a bigger effort for Sudan. What they understand is that you can't change hearts and minds overnight simply through a diplomatic agreement. There's something much more profound has to take place. And if you've been feeding people on a diet for generations, an anti-Semitic diet, a diet which portrays not just Israel, but Jews as dangerous and undesirable beings, you've got to do a profound psycho-spiritual switch. And you have to present them in a light at which people will now look at them different. And therefore, this has to do with our cultural, religious commonalities. And I've been very deeply involved in that. In fact, today, probably I spend much more time in the Muslim world than I do even in the Christian world, even in terms of travel, at least before COVID. Some of you may have noticed that just before COVID broke out, I was the first rabbi and the first Israeli to ever been received by the King of Saudi Arabia in his palace in Riyadh. And it was a fascinating thing. And I've been involved in a number of other Saudi initiatives, as well as also together with the Emirates. And this is a critical existential challenge for us. And I could go on for much longer, but I will say one thing. I am amazed of how, when I encounter people whose only knowledge and image of Jews is related to their negative perceptions in the light or the shadow of the political conflict, how when I start speaking to them religiously, showing respect for their religion, knowledge of their religion, and speak of my religious attachment to the land of Israel, attitudes change dramatically. If I speak politics, international law, whatever it is, historical justice, get nowhere. The moment I start speaking religion, I have a receptivity which is quite remarkable. And I can see in front of me how attitudes and perceptions are changing. We just need so many more soldiers in the field. There are so few of us.
Thank you.
Could I just say,
Yes.
I mean, if it's written in the Quran that Jews are pigs and dogs, and hiding behind every tree is a Jew, come and kill them, how can you change something like that? Because the Quran seems to be immutable. It isn't.
First of all, even if those things were written, and I'll come to them in a moment, there is always the possibility to be able to put things in context. Let me just tell you that we have rabbis here, to my utter shame, who say that Palestinians should be seen as Amalek, the prototype of evil doing, and that therefore it is religiously responsible to make a preemptive strike and to eliminate men, women, and children. So we have terrible people as well. But actually, the Quran does not. You're first of all bringing together two different things. There is a Quranic reference to God turning certain Jews into apes, into monkeys and pigs. Which Jews? The Quranic text talks about those Jews that desecrated the Shabbat and who did not keep their religion the way God wanted them to.
Okay.
Now, yes, there are those that take from that particular thing and want to say, well, then all Jews are pigs and monkeys, but that's not what the Quran says.
Okay.
And then you are quoting a hadith. The hadith is not a Quranic text, but a tradition from a pope. And that hadith is indeed problematic, but you will get serious scholars who will say, look, this can't be talking about all Jews because the Quran talks about respect for the Jews. And we have many hadiths of how the Prophet respected Jews and behaved towards Jews. It therefore can only be talking, and this is most common, the normative commentary, about those Jews who oppose Islam and who are the enemies of Islam, and only those Jews.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rabbi.
That's an excellent answer.